In the summer of 1983, a beautiful, sweet little toddler was being babysat by her grandmother while her parents went out on a rare date night at a drive-in movie theater. Her grandmother lived in the same building as her family, and the neighborhood was one where there were people around constantly, and the community looked out for one another. She was left alone for just minutes, and in those minutes, she vanished. The case I'm about to tell you about today is shaped by a mother's relentless search for answers. Anytime there's a new way to get the word out, she jumps on it. And with advancements in DNA, she hopes that someday soon she will be reunited with the little girl who was lost to her that day. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved abduction of Vinyette Teague. Vinyette Trudy Teague was born on December 8, 1981, to Kathy Teague and Albert Simmons. She had 3 older brothers, and she was the only girl of the family, so you can imagine how well taken care of and looked after she was, the little baby girl of the family after all. By summer of 1983, Vinyette was stepping into her own little personality as toddlers do. She was 18 months old and was described as a very cautious and shy child who only liked to be held by certain people who she knew well. She was walking and starting to talk. Her first words were mommy and water. She had also learned to express her preferences and would say things like yes or no. Her mom fondly remembers how she had a little rag doll who with no name that she would carry around everywhere she went. I don't know about you, but my kids had their very specific stuffed animals and blankies that they took everywhere too. She also used to suck her thumb, which I always think is the most precious thing when kids do that. It's the epitome of sweetness and innocence. Those closest to Vinyette gave her the nickname Yinny. The family did have its fair share of financial hardship, and at the time they were living in the Bronzeville neighborhood in the south side of Chicago, in the Robert H. Taylor homes, which was a subsidized housing project. And I want to take a moment to get more into this housing project because it's pretty well known and is a central part to this case. The Robert Taylor homes were built in 1962 and were the second largest housing project in all of the United States. The area was huge. There were 28 nearly identical high-rise buildings with 16 stories, each totaling just over 4,400 units. Vinyette's family lived in a building on the 5,000 block of South Federal Street. The idea behind building these had some good intent. Chicago was in desperate need of affordable housing, and this was set to be able to hold a capacity of around 11,000 residents. But things did not go according to plan. At its peak, there were actually a whopping 27,000 people living in those units. The buildings were often in disrepair and not meeting code. People were living in incredible poverty. At one point, 95% of the people who lived in the projects were unemployed and listed public assistance as their only income source. 40% of the residents were listed as single-parent, female-headed households with incomes of less than $5,000 per year. So in a lot of these instances, you had single mothers who literally couldn't afford to work because they couldn't afford daycare, and so it just became a cycle. In the Robert Taylor homes, a survey was conducted and showed that the majority of residents either had a family member in prison or expected one to return from prison within 2 years. This caused issues when residents tried to relocate. Many of these returning prisoners had partners, children, and/or mental illnesses that prevented them from relocating to a new location. The socioeconomic complexities of poverty and housing are too complicated to sink our teeth into and talk about in one podcast episode. But what is relevant is that things were happening in those projects that happen when people are struggling in poverty. Drug abuse, drug dealing, and gang activity. And when you picture this area, it's like a city of its own within Chicago. So it took those problems and really amplified them. During the peak of this time, there were 3 main gangs within these projects: the Mickey Cobras, the Gangster Disciples, and the Black Disciples. The 3 gangs had ongoing turf wars and tried to control the drug trade of different buildings, as well as within different Chicago neighborhoods. And to give you a point of reference for the scale of these operations, the Chicago Housing Authority estimated that there were $45,000 worth of drug sales completed daily. In one weekend, more than 300 separate shooting incidents happened in the vicinity of the Robert Taylor homes. 28 people were killed that weekend, with 26 being connected to gang activity. If you're wondering where the cops were, well, they often didn't really respond to this area. To give some perspective, it was quite dangerous for cops to show up. The hallways of the buildings were dark, and officers would be shot at from people standing in the high rises above. One time, a gang murdered a building custodian for giving officers access to the property when a gang meeting was occurring. In the 90s, the city began a redevelopment project for the area, with the goal of creating mixed-income housing in low-rise buildings and homes. By 2007, the last high-rise building was demolished. But despite all of these bad aspects of the projects I just told you, there was a lot of community within the buildings. Despite bad things happening in this area, being poor does not make you a bad person. Most of the people living here were just like Vinyette's family, kind neighbors doing their best to find joy and get by with very little. Vinyette's family had family within the same building, which was such a gift to be able to have such proximity to loved ones. If you wanted to see grandma, she was right across the way. There were also aunts and uncles and cousins. 1983 was a hot summer in Chicago. In fact, July of that year would have 2 record-breaking days of hitting 100 degrees, which wouldn't happen again for another 5 years and has only happened a handful of times since. The units in the building were not air-conditioned and it would get unbearable, so what people would do is hang out in the building breezeways. This can be a little tricky to picture. It was for me. So I found a picture of the Robert Taylor breezeways that I'll share on our Instagram at simplertimecrimepod. Picture a hallway or walkway outside of a second floor motel. And it's similar to that, but because these were high-rise buildings, they had safety fencing as well. People would put chairs out and sit outside, and so neighbors would get together and socialize because you were all out there together. And that's exactly the setup for the night of June 25th, 1983. On that night, Kathy and Albert were planning on leaving the kids with Kathy's mother next door to get away for a rare date night to the drive-in movie theater. Albert thought for a minute that they should take the kids with them, but Kathy really just wanted an adult night out, which is something completely relatable. I remember craving that when I had toddlers. So they said goodbye to the kids, and off they went around 9 p.m. At this point, Vinyette's grandmother took her outside into the breezeway for some air and so that she could play cards with the neighbors while watching Vinyette. With so many people on the breezeway, people were walking back and forth and in and out of each other's apartments constantly. Whatever hustle and bustle you're picturing, you're probably pretty close to spot on. The neighbor was one of those few chosen people who Vinyette was comfortable with. She sat on the lap of her neighbor while they played cards. At around 9:30, Vinyette's grandmother went inside to take a phone call and left Vinyette outside with the neighbor and other various people. At some point, the neighbor went inside to wash up some dishes, leaving Vinyette on the breezeway just outside her grandmother's door. When her grandmother came outside, Vinyette was nowhere to be seen. Those in the area frantically started calling her name and looking for her. it was estimated that there were about 50 residents on the breezeway that evening, including Vignette's own cousins, aunts, and uncles that I've mentioned before. And yet not a single person said that they saw anything. Vignette was wearing a striped tank top, brown flowered pants, and her hair was in short braids at the time. She was also barefoot. Kathy would later go on to say in an interview with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that she didn't blame anyone, that the tenants in her part of the building all knew each other, and that in the projects people just watched out for one another's kids. It was the whole "it takes a village" concept, and it ran really deep in their community. When Kathy and her husband arrived home in the early hours of the morning, she saw police cars and heard someone yelling down to her, "Kathy, Kathy, do you have your baby?" And she said her heart sunk because she just knew something had happened to Vignette. Kathy went door to door, building to building. She rifled through incinerator ashes and looked down elevator shafts. She asked everybody around what they saw, but everyone insisted that they saw nothing. One thing to consider here is our own human nature. The more people are around, the safer you may feel, but actually, people are paying less individualized attention. It reminds me of something I read about a few years back that talked about children drowning in swimming pools, and that you most often picture a kid just wandering into an unsupervised pool, which does happen. But more often, drowning accidents happen when there are a lot of people in a pool and adults are all talking to one another and people aren't paying close individualized attention. The neighbor who sat her back down that night likely thought that community care they all had been a part of was going to play out that night. But instead, it seems somebody in the community, at least passing through the community, took Vignette. Vignette's case gathered hardly any media attention, and this is something we talk about frequently in discussing true crime. There is a huge coverage gap in the media and public attention that Black missing persons get in comparison to their white counterparts. And while steps are being taken to lessen that, it still happens today. In the 1980s, this was wildly apparent. If Vignette was a little white toddler who was grabbed off her family's front porch in the suburbs, it would have been a national news story. But Vignette being a Black toddler living in a poor part of Chicago in a housing project prone to violence, she barely got a corner article in Chicago's local papers. But Kathy was not about to let her daughter's story stay quiet. So even though it took years to gain traction, she did everything she could to keep her daughter's story out there. And I'll get into this more in a minute. Vignette's parents were naturally the first people to be looked into, as is the case with any missing child investigation. They were cleared, and Kathy said she didn't feel offended that police looked into her. She knew they had to, and she knew she had nothing to hide. Police said that they brought in extra officers. They did grid searches, had canines there trying to track Vignette's scent, and they conducted dozens of interviews with residents. But not a trace of Vignette was ever found. The loss of their daughter put a strain on the relationship of Vignette's parents, and they eventually split, an occurrence that is so common in surviving families of crime, and it's not often talked about. The impact of how different people grieve and navigate life through trauma can inevitably change parts of who you are and how you cope, rendering previous connections incompatible. Kathy Teague worked to get Vignette's picture out there. Her most hopeful scenario, both then and now, was that somebody wanted a little girl to raise and had done so. She said that Vignette was on the neighborhood playground earlier that day, and she hypothesized that maybe someone saw her and wanted to take her because they couldn't have children, or a scenario like that. The alternative of what else could have happened to Vignette was too dark to even think about. But that didn't stop her from having difficult moments. Kathy said in interviews that she cried every single day. Sometimes people would call her up and tell her terrible things that happened to Vignette just to get a reaction out of her. One time, a person put a little girl on the phone to prank her and had the little girl scream, "Mommy, Mommy," into the phone, which just makes me feel sick to even think about. Like most cases I cover, days turned into weeks, which turned into months, which turned into years without even a lead in the case. To say that the case was cold was an understatement. In 1985, Kathy worked with papers to get Vinyette's picture as part of a feature piece with other missing kids across the country. This nationwide coverage had the hope that somebody in another state would recognize her if her abductor had fled the area. In the late 80s, Vinyette's sweet baby photo was put on a billboard on a Chicago interstate that nearly 700,000 cars passed through each day, but it didn't produce any viable leads. The late 80s were also when Kathy Teague was connected to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC. Kathy cannot praise this organization enough for all they have done for her and have tried to do in trying to find Vinyette. You're probably familiar with age progression photos in these types of cases. Those are almost exclusively created by NCMEC, and they are even more crucial in cases where the person who goes missing is very young or a baby. In this case, they updated Vinyette's age-progressed photo often, almost every couple of years. Kathy said she hoped that her little girl was out there and would recognize herself in one of the age-progressed photos. Kathy has remained steadfast that if she were to see her daughter, she would know her, even now that she would be all grown up. In 1991, a pro golfer had an idea to give back. PGA golfer Tim Simpson wanted to make a difference in the families of missing children. He had been drawn to children's causes after the birth of his own daughter, where she almost died during childbirth. Because he traveled a lot, he thought it could be beneficial to put a photo of missing children on his golf bag. The more he thought about it, the more the concept developed. Each tournament, he would feature the NCMEC photo of a missing child from that particular city. You can see a picture of one of his golf bags on the Instagram page. Sometimes the photos would have one of those age-progressed photos next to it. He would do a media soundbite about the case, and cameras would pan to his golf bag as he made it from hole to hole. From April 11th to April 14th, 1991, Simpson was participating in the Masters in Augusta, Georgia, and with him on his golf bag that week was a girl named Shannon Miner. Shannon had been abducted and was thought to be with her non-custodial father. Her parents divorced in 1983 when Shannon was a toddler. After the bitter divorce and custody feud, full custody was granted to Shannon's mother, Denise. But that's when Shannon and her father disappeared. Denise admitted she didn't even know who Tim Simpson was. She remembers asking the caseworker if he was any good at golf. She was grateful to the exposure as the cameras panned to his bag and announcers covering the Masters gave a description of Shannon and who to be in contact with if you had seen her. 5 days after the conclusion of this tournament, an anonymous caller called the tip line and said Shannon was living with her father in Texas. Authorities tracked down this lead and found Shannon safely with her father, who was promptly arrested. She would go on to say that her father would tell her that her mother was still alive and out there, but didn't have time to care for her. He had initially taken her out of the country to Brazil and then come back in to Alabama and eventually Texas. NCMEC strongly felt that Tim Simpson's visibility helped to solve this case, and Denise Miner said she could never repay Tim Simpson for the best Mother's Day gift she's ever received. So, in July of 1991, when he began his first round of golf at the Western Open at Cog Hill, he had a new picture with him. Front and center on his golf bag was the sweet face of Vinyette Teague. Simpson did media soundbites about her case and gave information about how to contact with any leads. But unlike the Miner case where phones began ringing off the hook, no such occurrences happened with Vinyette. In 2006, Kathy Teague jumped on the next round of advancements. A local police department had volunteered to be a part of a project that collected DNA samples from parents of missing children. These samples were then compiled in a database, and if the person was ever found, DNA could be used to make the connection quicker. Kathy was interviewed by Lolly Bowen of the Chicago Tribune when her DNA was collected. She talked about how painful it was to have neighbors gossip about her, speculating that she must actually know where her daughter is, and why, of all the kids out there unsupervised that night, someone would just take her baby. But the suspicion went both ways. Shortly after the abduction, she did move out with her sons because she couldn't bear to look at the faces of people whom she felt knew something about what happened to her daughter and that they just weren't saying something. Kathy said that for years she was haunted by a reoccurring nightmare about her daughter's abduction. Visions of the girl who would cry anytime she was picked up by somebody she didn't know or was uncomfortable with, picturing a stranger taking her away as she screamed. And I will say that part does puzzle me, and I keep coming back to it. Had she wandered off and then was far enough away when somebody grabbed her that the immediate neighbors who knew her didn't hear her scream? One source references that she was in a stroller, but I only saw that reported once, so I'm not completely sure. If she was, then that would be unlikely. Or did the person who take her have some familiarity with her, enough that this person was one of her comfortable people that she was okay with being held by? At the time of this recording, 41 years have passed without answers. DNA of Kathy's sits in a database. More and more people each year do DNA kits through places like 23andMe and Ancestry. Kathy holds out hope that maybe, just maybe, her daughter is still out there and that this will be the year that she does this. Kathy has given back over the years to NCMEC, the organization whom she credits with helping her so much over the years. She volunteers as a peer advocate to parents of other missing children. She has said that the age-progressed photo of Vinyette has allowed her to feel like she can picture what her little girl looked like as she was growing up, and that it gives her hope. I mentioned some of these things when I covered the abduction of David Blockett on episode 2 of this podcast. That was the one where he was an infant and abducted by somebody posing as a social worker. Because of the nature of this case, I think it bears repeating. So if Vinyette is out there, here are some of the ways and red flags you might know if you suspect you were abducted as a child. More often than not, children abducted by strangers to be raised by their own, they're typically abducted by a woman. This person may have inconsistent backstories of your birth and childhood and may not have a lot of baby pictures, if any of you. They might not be able to produce legal documents, or if they do, you might find that certain legal documents have elements of forgery or question the legitimacy of them. You may find that you have a lack of early memories. You may find that you don't have a lot of resemblance to your parents. You may have been told you were adopted, which can be a little trickier because we know legitimate adoption is a thing. Lastly, some who have gone on to find out their parents were not their parents have expressed that as they were growing up, they just felt this disconnect that they couldn't quite put their finger on, but that it stayed with them through life till they found out the truth. The hope is that Vinyette Teague was cared for by somebody all of these years, and that her curiosity into her early days will lead her down a path of connecting with her birth family. But of course, there's always the large possibility that a predator was walking the breezeway of the projects that night and seized an opportunity to abduct a young child to assault and kill, and that she's just never been found. While wanting the best of outcomes, the hope is that in sharing her story, regardless of what happened, the truth comes out. I believe, like Kathy, that somebody besides whoever did this saw something in the hallway that night. 41 years is a long time to carry something on your conscience. Imagine that feeling, and then imagine how her mother must feel, walking every day without her only daughter. Today is the day to do the right thing. If you have any information on the abduction of Vinyette Teague, contact NCMEC at 1-800-THE-LOST or contact the Chicago Police Department at 312-744-8266. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please follow the podcast on your various social media channels. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and each week I share pictures that correspond to the case on Instagram. 5-star reviews and word of mouth also help bring visibility to the podcast and get more attention on these cold cases. For case suggestions, please contact simplertimecrimepod at gmail.com. If you have a family member who you'd like to be featured on the show, please reach out, as I'd love to capture your voice and lived experience in the search for answers. Join me next week, and as always, thank you so much for listening.